The Bentley slammed into the oak tree at exactly 6:47 a.m. Metal screamed, glass exploded. Steam hissed from the crumpled hood as Ben Carson pulled over on the empty stretch of Route 12. Inside the wreckage, a woman lay motionless, designer heels scattered across broken glass, blood pooling beneath her platinum blonde hair. Ben didn't hesitate. He yanked open the twisted door, lifted her unconscious body, and carried her to safety, while his 8-year-old son Noah watched wide-eyed from their beat-up pickup truck. The ambulance arrived 12 minutes later. Ben waited until the paramedics took over, then quietly slipped away into the Pennsylvania morning mist. He left no name, no number, no trace, except for a worn wooden pencil that had tumbled from his jacket pocket onto the hospital blanket. What Ben didn't know was that he'd just saved Alexandra Whitmore, heiress to a $3 billion art empire. And what Alexandra would never understand was why her guardian angel had vanished without asking for a single thing in return. 2 years had passed since Linda Carson lost her battle with cancer, leaving Ben to raise Noah alone in their small house on Maple Street in Millbrook. The town knew their story. Everyone did in a place where gossip traveled faster than the morning paper. Mrs. Patterson next door still brought casseroles twice a week, her way of checking on the widower, who worked 16-hour days at his one-man auto repair shop. Ben appreciated the kindness, but he'd learned to be self-sufficient. He had to be. Noah was watching, absorbing every lesson about resilience and quiet strength that life threw their way. The garage behind their house had become both sanctuary and lifeline. Ben fixed everything from rusted farm trucks to fancy imports, his calloused hands working magic on engines that other mechanics had given up on. Noah would sit in the corner after school, sketching in his notebook with the same worn wooden pencil his mother had used for her small paintings. The boy rarely spoke about his artwork, but Ben noticed how his drawings always featured families. Complete families with mothers and fathers and children, the kind Noah remembered from before the world shifted beneath their feet. Linda's presence lingered everywhere in their routine. Her coffee mug still sat in the cabinet, untouched but not forgotten. Her garden tools hung neatly in the shed, waiting for hands that would never return. The oak tree in their backyard bore the initials she'd carved during their first summer as homeowners, back when the future seemed infinite and cancer was just a word that happened to other people. Ben had taught Noah early that grief wasn't something to overcome. It was something to carry, like love, only heavier. Money was always tight, but Ben made it work through sheer determination and the occasional miracle. The upcoming school fees loomed large in his mind, another reminder that single parenthood meant being perpetually one emergency away from disaster. Still, he refused charity from neighbors or the church. Pride, Linda used to call it, though she'd say it with a smile that took the sting away. Now that smile existed only in photographs, and in the way Noah's eyes crinkled when he laughed, a genetic gift that time couldn't steal. But on this particular morning, as Ben drove Noah to school, neither of them could have imagined that their carefully constructed life was about to intersect with wealth beyond their comprehension. The woman Ben had pulled from the Bentley was already plotting her return to Millbrook, driven by a curiosity she couldn't name and a debt she couldn't quantify. Alexandra Whitmore had built her reputation on acquiring priceless art, but she'd never encountered anything quite like the mystery of a good Samaritan who expected nothing in return. The weeks following the accident blurred together in Alexandra's mind like watercolors in rain. Board meetings in Manhattan glass towers felt hollow after her brush with mortality on a Pennsylvania back road. She found herself staring out conference room windows, thinking about calloused hands that had pulled her to safety and kind eyes that had asked for nothing. The worn wooden pencil sat on her desk like a talisman, a reminder that genuine goodness still existed in a world that increasingly felt artificial and transactional. Watson, the private investigator she'd hired, was thorough but discreet. His report arrived on a Tuesday. Ben Carson, 34 years old, widowed, owns Carson Auto Repair in Millbrook. One child, Noah, 8 years old. No criminal record, no outstanding debts beyond the usual small-town struggles, credit score average. The facts painted a picture of ordinary decency, the kind of life Alexandra had read about but never experienced. She studied the grainy surveillance photos Watson had included, Ben working under the hood of a car, Noah sitting nearby with his sketchbook, both of them inhabiting a world she'd only glimpsed from behind tinted windows. The plan formed slowly, carefully, like a masterpiece taking shape on canvas. Alexandra couldn't simply show up as herself. The Whitmore name would change everything, create obligations and expectations that would poison whatever authenticity had drawn her to this place. Instead, she would become someone else, someone normal. She practiced the persona in her Manhattan penthouse, shedding decades of privilege like expensive clothing. She would be Allie Mitchell, a woman passing through town, nothing more threatening than a stranger needing car repairs. The transformation required more than just a wardrobe change. Alexandra studied how regular people moved through the world, how they spoke about money and work and dreams. She rented a modest apartment an hour away from Millbrook, bought used clothing from thrift stores, and learned to do her own makeup without the assistance of a professional stylist. The woman who emerged from this chrysalis bore little resemblance to the CEO whose face graced business magazine covers, and that was exactly the point. When Allie Mitchell's rented Honda Civic pulled into Carson Auto Repair on a crisp autumn morning, Ben barely looked up from the transmission he was rebuilding. Customers were customers, and he treated them all the same, with professional courtesy and honest pricing. But something about this particular woman made him pause. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, like someone unaccustomed to asking for help. Maybe it was how her eyes lingered on Noah's artwork taped to the wall, studying each crayon drawing with the intensity of a museum curator. Ben wiped his hands on a shop rag and approached the counter where Allie waited. She explained that her car was making strange noises, probably nothing serious, but she'd feel better having it checked. Her accent was cultured, educated, but she seemed genuinely nervous about the potential cost of repairs. Ben quoted her a fair price for a diagnostic check and watched something like relief flood her features. Most wealthy customers barely blinked at his estimates, but Allie Mitchell clutched her purse like someone counting every dollar. The Honda's problem turned out to be minor, a loose belt that took 20 minutes to fix and cost $37 in parts and labor. Allie seemed surprised by the modest bill, then pleased in a way that suggested she wasn't accustomed to pleasant surprises. She paid in cash, crisp 20s that looked fresh from the bank, and lingered by the counter as if reluctant to leave. Noah had wandered over during the repair, curious about the stranger who'd complimented his drawings, and now he was showing her his latest sketches with the enthusiasm only 8-year-olds could muster. Something magical happened in those few minutes. Allie knelt to Noah's eye level, really listening as he explained his artistic process, asking questions that proved she understood more about composition and color than most adults. She pointed out details in his work that even Ben had missed, praising techniques the boy had developed instinctively. When Noah shyly showed her his most treasured possession, the wooden pencil his mother had used, Allie's breath caught in a way that seemed almost recognition. But that was impossible, of course. She'd never been to Millbrook before this moment. Over the following weeks, Allie became a familiar presence at the garage. Her car seemed to develop new minor problems with suspicious frequency. A squeaky brake pad here, a loose wire there, nothing expensive but enough to justify regular visits. Ben found himself looking forward to these appointments, though he couldn't quite explain why. Allie was easy to talk to, possessed of a dry humor that made even mundane conversations enjoyable. She had opinions about everything from local politics to the best pizza in town, but she asked more questions than she answered, as if genuinely curious about how life worked in places like Millbrook. Noah adored her immediately and completely, the way children sometimes attach to adults who treat them as equals rather than miniature versions of grown-ups. Ali would arrive with sketchbooks and quality pencils, ostensibly for her own hobby, but always ending up in Noah's eager hands. She taught him techniques for capturing light and shadow, for making flat drawings feel dimensional and alive. Under her tutelage, his artwork evolved from simple crayon pictures to sophisticated pencil sketches that belonged in galleries rather than on refrigerator doors. Ben watched these interactions with growing warmth and nagging concern. Noah had been withdrawn since Linda's death, polite, but distant even with well-meaning neighbors and teachers. But Ali brought out a side of his son that Ben had feared was lost forever. The curious, talkative boy who'd once believed the world was full of wonders waiting to be discovered. The transformation was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure, because Ben knew that people like Ali Mitchell didn't stay in places like Millbrook forever. The autumn afternoons stretched longer as Ali's visits became routine rather than coincidence. She'd arrive just as Noah got home from school, timing that seemed natural, but struck Ben as oddly convenient. Sometimes she'd help with homework, displaying knowledge that ranged from advanced mathematics to art history to business principles. When Ben mentioned his concerns about Noah's upcoming school fees, Ali casually suggested several scholarship programs and grants she'd heard about, providing details that seemed remarkably specific for someone just passing through town. Their first shared dinner happened almost by accident. Ali's car had required more extensive work than usual, keeping her at the garage past Noah's bedtime. Ben offered to drive her to her hotel, but she politely declined, mentioning she'd grab something from the diner down the road. Noah, with the blunt honesty of childhood, announced that his father made the best spaghetti in Pennsylvania, and it would be rude not to invite their friend to stay. Ben found himself agreeing before he could think of reasons to object, and an hour later they were sitting around his small kitchen table, like a family he'd almost forgotten how to imagine. The evening felt dangerously normal. Ali helped clear dishes, commenting on the framed photos that chronicled the Carson family's happier times. She studied Linda's face in the pictures with careful attention, making observations about the love that radiated from those captured moments. When Noah asked if Ali had ever been married, she grew quiet for a long moment before saying that some people were meant for different kinds of love stories. Ben understood that response in ways he couldn't articulate, recognizing someone else who'd learned that happiness came in many forms, not all of them conventional. As winter settled over Millbrook like a familiar blanket, Ben realized he was falling for Ali Mitchell in ways that both thrilled and terrified him. She fit into their lives so seamlessly it seemed impossible that she'd ever existed anywhere else. But later tonight, when Noah was asleep and the house was quiet, Ben couldn't shake the feeling that Ali was performing rather than simply being. Her stories about her past remained vague, her references to family and former jobs carefully generic. She deflected personal questions with the skill of someone accustomed to maintaining privacy, though she seemed genuinely interested in every detail of Ben and Noah's life. The first crack in Ali's carefully constructed facade appeared on a Thursday evening in December. She'd been helping Noah with a particularly challenging art project when her phone rang with a tone Ben had never heard before. Classical music, expensive sounding. Ali answered without thinking, her voice shifting into cadences of command and authority that belonged in boardrooms rather than small-town garages. The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds, but in that brief exchange, Ben heard fragments that didn't fit, references to acquisitions and board meetings, mentions of New York and international travel. When Ali hung up, she looked stricken, as if she'd revealed more than she intended. The explanation came quickly, perhaps too quickly. "A former employer," she said, still trying to pull her back into a job she'd left months ago. Corporate headhunters could be persistent, especially in her old field of art consulting. The story was plausible, professionally delivered, but something in Ali's eyes suggested layers of truth she couldn't share. Ben wanted to probe deeper, but Noah was listening with the alert attention children reserve for adult conversations they sense might be important. Instead, Ben filed the moment away with the growing collection of small mysteries that surrounded Ali Mitchell. Christmas approached with the relentless cheer that small towns did better than anywhere else. Millbrook's Main Street twinkled with lights that reflected off snow-covered storefronts, and the annual holiday market filled the town square with the scents of cinnamon and pine. Ben had been dreading the season, their second Christmas without Linda, but Ali's presence transformed what might have been a melancholy commemoration into something approaching joy. She helped Noah pick out presents for his father, guided him through the process of wrapping gifts with careful precision, and somehow made their modest celebrations feel abundant rather than lacking. On Christmas Eve, as they sat by the small tree in Ben's living room, Ali presented Noah with a gift that took both father and son's breath away. It was a professional-quality art set, complete with pencils, charcoals, and papers that belonged in serious artists' studios rather than 8-year-old boys' bedrooms. The price tag had been carefully removed, but Ben recognized luxury when he saw it. When he started to object to such an expensive gift, Ali cut him off with gentle firmness, explaining that talent like Noah's deserved proper tools. She'd seen enough artists, she said, to recognize genuine gift when it appeared. That night, after Noah had fallen asleep surrounded by his new art supplies, Ben and Ali sat in comfortable silence watching snow fall outside the kitchen window. The moment felt pregnant with possibilities and confessions, with words that wanted to be spoken but couldn't quite find their way into the light. Ben almost asked directly who Ali Mitchell really was, what she was really doing in Millbrook, why someone with her obvious refinement and resources had chosen to spend months in his orbit. But fear held him back, fear that knowing the truth might mean losing whatever this was they'd built together. The answer came anyway, delivered by circumstances beyond Ali's control. On a cold January evening, as they shared another of their increasingly frequent dinners, a knock at Ben's door shattered the domestic tranquility they'd cultivated. Through the frosted glass, Ben could see the silhouette of a well-dressed man who clearly didn't belong in their neighborhood. When Ben opened the door, the stranger introduced himself as Watson, a private investigator looking for someone who'd been missing for several months. He produced a photograph that made Ben's blood run cold. It was Ali, but not Ali as he knew her. This version wore tailored business suits and stood next to paintings worth more than Ben's house, garage, and truck combined. Watson's explanation was methodical and devastating. The woman Ben knew as Ali Mitchell was actually Alexandra Whitmore, CEO of the Whitmore Foundation and heiress to one of America's largest art fortunes. She'd disappeared from New York 6 months earlier following what Watson diplomatically called a personal crisis, and her family had been searching for her ever since. The investigator's tone was professional but not unkind as he delivered this information, clearly accustomed to delivering uncomfortable truths to people who'd become collateral damage in rich people's problems. Ben listened with growing numbness as Watson detailed Alexandra's background, the boarding schools and Ivy League education, the trust funds and corporate responsibilities, the world of wealth and privilege that might as well have existed on another planet. This explained everything and nothing, answering questions Ben hadn't known he should ask while raising new ones that felt too dangerous to contemplate. The woman who'd become integral to his and Noah's happiness wasn't who she'd claimed to be. But more disturbing was the realization that he'd fallen in love with someone who was essentially playing a role. When Watson left, Ben sat at his kitchen table staring at the business card the investigator had left behind. The Whitmore Foundation's Manhattan address might as well have been coordinates for Mars, so foreign did that world feel from his reality of overdue bills and second-hand clothes. Noah was upstairs doing homework, blissfully unaware that his beloved friend Ali was actually someone named Alexandra, who owned companies and foundations and probably had more money in her checking account than Ben would earn in a lifetime. The scope of the deception felt breathtaking, but what hurt more was trying to understand the why behind it all. The confrontation Ben had been dreading came the next day, when Alexandra, arrived for what had become her usual after-school visit with Noah. Ben met her at the garage door, Watson's business card held between them like evidence in a trial. The color drained from her face as she recognized the investigator's name, and for the first time since he'd known her, Ali Mitchell seemed speechless. The careful composure she'd maintained for months cracked visibly, revealing something raw and desperate underneath the performance. Alexandra's explanation came in fragments, like pieces of a puzzle she wasn't sure she wanted to assemble. She'd been suffocating in New York, she said, drowning in expectations and obligations that felt more like prison sentences than privileges. When Ben had saved her life on Route 12, when he'd walked away without asking for anything, it had shown her a kind of goodness she'd forgotten existed. She'd needed to understand it, to be around it, to remember what it felt like to be valued for something other than her net worth or her family name. The months in Millbrook hadn't been research or charity work. They'd been the first time in her adult life she'd felt genuinely human. But Ben's anger had been building through her explanation, fed by months of deception and the growing realization of how thoroughly he'd been manipulated. Noah burst through the garage door just as Ben's composure finally snapped, demanding to know what gave Alexandra the right to treat their lives like some kind of social experiment. The boy froze in the doorway, sensing the adult tension that charged the air like electricity before a storm. Ben's voice was harsh as he told Alexandra that they'd been fine before she arrived, and they'd be fine after she left. They didn't need her money or her pity or whatever twisted form of entertainment their friendship had provided. The words hung in the air like smoke from something burning. Noah looked confused and hurt, clutching his sketchbook against his chest as if it could protect him from the collapse of yet another stable thing in his young life. Alexandra's eyes filled with tears she didn't try to hide, but she didn't defend herself against Ben's accusations. Instead, she knelt to Noah's level one last time, telling him that he was the most talented artist she'd ever met and that talent would take him anywhere he wanted to go. She kissed his forehead gently, whispered something in his ear that made him nod seriously, then stood and walked away without looking back. Ben watched from the garage doorway as Alexandra's rented Honda pulled out of their driveway for the last time. The silence that followed felt different from the comfortable quiet they'd shared on winter evenings. This was the heavy silence of endings, of bridges burned and trust broken beyond repair. Noah asked only one question. "Is Ali coming back tomorrow?" When Ben shook his head, the boy simply nodded and returned to his room, closing the door with careful precision. That evening, Ben found Noah's latest drawing on the kitchen table, a picture of 3 people under an oak tree, with one figure carefully erased until only a faint outline remained. The days that followed felt like recovery from surgery, necessary but painful, with healing that happened too slowly to notice. Ben threw himself into work with renewed intensity, taking on projects that required his complete attention and left no time for brooding. Noah retreated into his artwork, but with grim determination rather than joy, as if drawing had become obligation rather than pleasure. Mrs. Patterson stopped by more frequently, armed with casseroles and concerned questions that Ben deflected with practiced politeness. The house felt hollow in ways that had nothing to do with Linda's absence and everything to do with the ghost of a woman who'd never really existed. 3 weeks after Alexandra's departure, Ben made a decision that surprised even himself. He called the garage's few remaining appointments to reschedule, loaded their essential belongings into the pickup truck, and told Noah they were starting over somewhere new. The boy accepted this news with the resignation of someone accustomed to loss, asking only if he could bring his art supplies, the expensive ones Allie had given him for Christmas. Ben almost said no, then realized punishing Noah for his own broken heart would be petty and cruel. They packed everything that mattered, left the keys with Mrs. Patterson, and drove away from Millbrook on a Tuesday morning when the rest of the world was rushing to work. The city they chose was neither large nor small, neither familiar nor completely foreign, just different enough to feel like genuine escape. Ben found work at an established auto repair shop, whose owner was nearing retirement and needed reliable help. Noah enrolled in a new school where nobody knew their history, where teachers saw only a quiet boy with exceptional artistic talent rather than a motherless child to be pitied. They rented a small apartment above a deli, nothing fancy but clean and safe and theirs. For the first time in months, Ben felt like he could breathe without wondering when the next shoe would drop. The routine they established was deliberately simple: work, school, home, repeat. Ben avoided forming close friendships, keeping his interactions professional and pleasant, but shallow. Noah seemed to thrive in his new environment, making friends with the easy adaptability of childhood, while continuing to develop his artistic skills with an intensity that sometimes worried his father. The expensive art supplies got regular use, though Noah never mentioned their origin, and Ben tried not to think about the woman who'd recognized his son's talent when others saw only cute kid drawings. But on a cold morning in March, their carefully constructed new life collided with their old one in the most devastating way possible. Ben was at work when the call came from Noah's school. His son had collapsed during art class and was being rushed to Children's Hospital. The next several hours blurred into a nightmare of waiting rooms and medical terminology that sounded like a foreign language. Congenital heart defect, the doctors explained, probably present from birth but dormant until triggered by stress or illness. Surgery was possible, even likely to succeed, but it would be expensive, and Noah's condition was serious enough to require immediate intervention. The financial reality hit Ben like a physical blow. His insurance had basic coverage, but nothing approaching what Noah's surgery would cost. The hospital's financial counselor was kind but realistic. They could work out payment plans, apply for assistance programs, but the bottom line remained stark and unforgiving. Ben found himself making desperate calculations, trying to figure out how to mortgage a future he wasn't sure they'd have. The irony wasn't lost on him that the woman who could have solved this problem with a single phone call was someone he'd driven away in anger and pride. What happened next surprised everyone, most of all Ben himself. As he sat in the hospital waiting room, wrestling with pride and desperation in equal measure, a familiar figure appeared in the doorway. Alexandra Whitmore walked into that sterile space like she belonged there, wearing the same simple clothes she'd favored as Allie Mitchell, but carrying herself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to making things happen. She didn't offer explanations for how she'd learned about Noah's condition or why she'd traveled hundreds of miles to be there. She simply sat down beside Ben and said, "How can I help?" The conversation that followed was unlike any they'd ever had. Alexandra didn't try to justify her earlier deception or apologize for the hurt she'd caused. Instead, she focused entirely on Noah's immediate needs, explaining that she'd already spoken with the hospital's administration about establishing an anonymous fund to cover his medical expenses. The foundation would handle everything discreetly, she assured Ben, with no publicity or recognition required. When he started to object, she cut him off with gentle firmness, pointing out that Noah's health was more important than their adult pride and complications. But the real revelation came when Alexandra explained why she'd returned to their lives at this crucial moment. She'd never stopped monitoring their welfare from a distance, she admitted, using resources available to someone with her connections and wealth. When Noah's name appeared in hospital records, she dropped everything to be there, not because she felt obligated or guilty, but because she loved them both too much to let pride prevent her from helping when they truly needed it. The confession hung between them like a bridge neither had been sure still existed. Noah's surgery was successful, though the recovery would be long and require ongoing medical attention. Alexandra arranged for the best pediatric cardiologist in the state to oversee his care, again through anonymous channels that left Ben's dignity intact, while ensuring his son received treatment that would have been financially impossible otherwise. She visited Noah daily during his hospital stay, bringing sketchbooks and stories and the kind of easy companionship that made healing feel less like work and more like returning to life. During those long hospital days, Ben and Alexandra began to rebuild something that resembled trust, though it looked different from what they'd shared in Millbrook. The pretense was gone. She was Alexandra Whitmore, not Ali Mitchell, and the wealth and responsibility that came with her real identity couldn't be ignored or wished away. But underneath the surface differences, the connection that had drawn them together remained intact. They talked honestly for the first time about their respective fears and failures, about the loneliness that had driven Alexandra to create Ali, and the pride that had driven Ben to reject help he desperately needed. The hardest conversation came on the day Noah was discharged from the hospital. As they prepared to return to their apartment, Alexandra finally asked the question that had been haunting both of them. What happened now? Ben's initial instinct was to retreat again, to thank her for her help, and then disappear before things got complicated. But Noah, with the wisdom that sometimes emerges from children who've faced mortality earlier than they should, pointed out that running away was just another form of lying. If they cared about each other, and Noah was certain they did, then they needed to find a way to be honest about it. The solution they eventually reached was imperfect, but genuine. Alexandra would return to New York and her responsibilities there, but she wouldn't disappear from their lives entirely. She'd visit when she could, maintain the friendship that had sustained them all through crisis, and see where honesty might lead them. Ben would stay in their new city with Noah, building the stable life his son deserved while remaining open to possibilities he'd been too afraid to consider. It wasn't a traditional happy ending, but it felt true to who they'd become and what they'd learned about love and trust and the courage required for both. 6 months later, on a crisp autumn afternoon that reminded Ben of their first meeting, Alexandra's rental car pulled into the parking lot of Ben's new garage. She'd called ahead this time, no more surprise visits or mysterious appearances. Noah was waiting by the window, his latest artwork spread across the workbench like offerings to someone he'd missed more than he'd been able to express. Ben watched from the doorway as mother and son, for that's what they'd become in all the ways that mattered, embraced with the fierce joy of people who'd learned not to take togetherness for granted. The garage had a new corner now, specifically designed for Noah's art projects. His sketches covered one wall like a gallery exhibition, showing the progression of his talent under Alexandra's continued long-distance mentorship. She'd arranged for him to take classes with a renowned local artist, again through carefully anonymous channels, and his work was beginning to attract attention from people who understood such things. But more importantly, Noah was drawing from joy again rather than obligation, creating pictures that captured not what he'd lost, but what he'd found. Ben and Alexandra didn't rush toward definitions or commitments that might have felt forced or premature. Instead, they allowed their relationship to develop naturally, built on the foundation of truth they'd finally learned to share. She would stay for a weekend here, a week there, fitting into their routine without overwhelming it. Sometimes they felt like a family, sometimes they felt like close friends. Sometimes they felt like something entirely new that didn't have a name yet. The ambiguity that might once have frustrated them now felt like freedom, the luxury of discovering what they meant to each other without external pressures or expectations. The town began to accept Alexandra's periodic presence without much curiosity or gossip. She was Ben's friend from New York, someone successful who'd chosen to invest her time and resources in their small community. She quietly funded art programs at the local schools, supported small businesses that were struggling, and treated everyone she met with the same genuine interest she'd shown as Allie Mitchell. The difference was that now people knew who she was, which somehow made her more trustworthy rather than less. Authenticity, Ben realized, was magnetic in ways that performance could never be. As winter settled over their new life, Ben found himself thinking less about what they'd lost in Millbrook and more about what they'd gained through the journey that brought them here. Noah was healthier and happier than he'd been since Linda's death, his artistic talents blossoming under encouragement from someone who truly understood creative gift. Alexandra had found a way to integrate her wealth and responsibility with the kind of personal connections she'd craved, using her resources to make meaningful differences in individual lives rather than just funding abstract causes. But perhaps most importantly, Ben had learned to accept help without feeling diminished by it, to recognize that love sometimes required swallowing pride and allowing others to share both burdens and joys. The lesson had come at considerable cost: months of deception, a child's medical crisis, the pain of multiple separations and reconciliations. But the resulting relationship felt stronger for having been tested by reality rather than preserved in the amber of fantasy. The story might have ended there, with hard-won happiness and lessons learned, but life rarely provides such tidy conclusions. On a cold February morning, as Ben was opening the garage for another day of honest work, he found an envelope that had been slipped under the door overnight. Inside was a single sheet of expensive paper bearing Alexandra's distinctive handwriting. "Some things don't need to be defined to be real. Thank you for teaching me that love isn't about staying or leaving. It's about choosing each other every day in whatever form that choice takes." He looked up to find Noah standing in the doorway, backpack slung over one shoulder and a new sketch in his free hand. The drawing showed 3 figures under a tree, but this time none of them were erased or fading. Instead, they stood close together, but separate, connected by invisible threads that suggested presence without possession, love without ownership. When Ben asked what he'd drawn, Noah smiled with the quiet confidence of someone who'd figured out something important. "It's us," he said simply. "All of us the way we really are." That afternoon, Alexandra's usual call came right on schedule, her voice carrying the warmth of someone who'd found her place in a story that didn't follow conventional rules. They talked about Noah's latest art project, about Ben's plans to expand the garage, about 1,000 small things that mattered because they were shared. When the call ended, Ben didn't feel the familiar ache of separation. Instead, he felt the quiet satisfaction of someone whose life was exactly as complex and beautiful and imperfect as it was meant to be. Outside the garage window, snow began to fall in fat, lazy flakes that transformed the ordinary street into something magical. Noah looked up from his artwork long enough to watch the weather change, then returned to his drawing with the focused intensity of someone creating beauty from blank spaces. Ben went back to work on the engine that had challenged him all morning, finding solutions through patience and skill and the kind of quiet persistence that had carried him through harder problems than stubborn carburetors. The pencil Noah used was new, part of a set Alexandra had sent for his birthday, but he kept the original wooden one, the one that had started everything, in a place of honor on his desk. It served as a reminder not of what had been lost or found, but of what was possible when people chose to see the best in each other, despite all the reasons they might choose otherwise. Some stories end with weddings or declarations or dramatic revelations. But the best ones sometimes end with the simple recognition that love takes many forms, not all of them requiring names or ceremonies or promises beyond the decision to keep showing up, day after day, for the people who matter most. And in a small garage in a city that wasn't too big or too small, where a widowed father worked alongside his gifted son while staying connected to a woman who'd learned that home wasn't a place but a choice, that's exactly what happened. Every single day,